Thank you, John, and thank you for having me. I mean, the mention of Rex Joyner earlier reminded me that I actually gave the Royal Perth lecture one year at the town hall. You had to wear a black tie. That's all I remember of it. It was nice. It was a nice time, and I was very honoured, as I always am, to be asked to speak in Western Australia. I want to acknowledge country. I also want to acknowledge that these are not good times. The shameful result of the referendum nearly 2 weeks ago is a real problem for medicine and medical research, because there was solid evidence behind the voice. Fiona Stanley here in Western Australia really pushed that view and the evidence, as did others. And if you're of any doubt about that, the voice was about control. The voice was about having a voice in decisions that are being made about Aboriginal communities. So just give me a moment here before I'm going to talk about community science and tough times. These are tough times for Australia. This is a very difficult period. So what's the evidence? If you look at the work of Michael Marmot, expatriate Australian in London at UCL, he has spent his career following on from Sir Geoffrey Rose, then at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, now at UCL, to explain the gap. So wherever you go, there's a gap. So there's a shameful gap of 8 years in life expectancy between First Nations peoples and non-Indigenous Australians. That's in life expectancy, which you all know is an average. If you actually look at lifespan and you look at the longest lived suburb or postcode in Australia and the shortest lived, this is the data for Professor John Glover in Adelaide, is 45 years. 45 years. So whichever city you like to go to, you get the train from the Esplanade north to Joondalup or south to Mandurah, life expectancy goes down almost by station. Take it from Central Station out west in Sydney, same deal. Flinders Street in Melbourne, same deal. There's life expectancy gaps wherever you look. The city I grew up in Glasgow, the life expectancy gap between the longest lived suburb and the shortest lived was about 20 years. So what is the cause of this health gradient that you observe ubiquitously, but particularly in Australia, acutely between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians? So he looked at the British civil service. Geoffrey Rose did the first Whitehall study, and Michael was involved in the second, Whitehall 2. Very hierarchical organisation. As anybody here is old enough to remember Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, the British comedy. The people who laughed at, there's a certain age gap there, but so the people at the top of the British civil service lived longer, healthier lives than the people at the bottom. So what was the reason? So people say, well, we know the reason. It's cholesterol levels. It's access to healthcare. It's education. Education, by the way, as you all know, I'm talking to an audience that knows this stuff, is a very potent cause of a healthier, longer lifespan. But even when you extracted all those variables, there was still a gradient. The gradient was less, but there was still a gradient there. What was the factor that could explain it? So Michael and his team factored in locus of control. So for the psychologists in the audience, you will now fail me in first year psychology as I describe internal locus of control. But put simply is, where do I feel my life's controlled? Is it here with me, or is it somewhere else over there? So you can lose locus of control in a lousy job with a lousy boss. You lose locus of control with a diagnosis of cancer. They've shown that in more than one research study that if, particularly focused on breast cancer, but within weeks of a cancer diagnosis, people lose their locus of control. It goes to the cancer unit, the oncologist, the team, their rounds of chemotherapy. And it also happens with disadvantage and deprivation. So people say, when you say this sort of, so what's that got to do with the gap? So when he factored in locus of control, the health gradient almost disappeared. In other words, he'd found a significant cause of the gradient. Not the only one, but a significant cause of the gradient. So is this some left-wing pinko conspiracy here that locus of control affects the gradient, the life expectancy gradient. So the late Professor Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, I don't know how many Nobel laureates they've got a lot, or had a lot over the last 100 years. He studied the neurophysiological correlates of loss of locus of control, called it allostatic load. And essentially, whenever anybody here has lost locus of control, they know it, because you feel lousy, you feel chronically stressed. And of course, the brain, the brain runs everything in the body, and I say this in the presence of Professor Beasley, but the brain runs everything, and we forget this at our peril. And when the brain is scanning our environment, it scans our relationships, it scans for our general perception of the world around us, and it translates that into neurochemical, neurophysiological messages to the rest of the body. And what happens is that chronic stress alerts the innate immune system, so inflammation goes up, blood pressure goes up, pulse rate goes up, cortisol levels either go very high or very low, and the result is you prematurely age. It affects every tissue in the body. That loss of locus of control. The voice was about returning locus of control to Aboriginal communities, one of the most potent causes of the gap. And what Fiona added to that was when you actually listen to Aboriginal communities, health outcomes are better. Birthing on country. They've narrowed the gap in the Northern Territory because they've got more say in what happens with health services, and so on. So my preaching here about the voice, but we as a medical and scientific community have got to really stand up to the mark here about how we work with Aboriginal communities towards narrowing that gap and improving outcomes for Aboriginal communities by listening. And of course, one of the things that Western Australia has done extremely well, work of Anne McKenzie and others, is actually integrating consumers into research planning. I don't know the extent to which it's happening with the foundation, but so researchers, particularly basic researchers, have resented that and said, what could consumers add to this? But those who've done it actually appreciate it because consumers are a practical and pragmatic voice at the table and contribute to the ideation that goes into research and possibly hold you to task in terms of research outcomes. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to acknowledge Bryant Stokes. Bryant is just one of the giants in healthcare and health in Western Australia. I can't tell you the number of people who recognize Bryant as their mentor, as somebody they look up to, who has spanned both clinical work, research, and indeed healthcare administration. Probably a little too gentle for healthcare administration, but nonetheless, he was somebody who was willing to put himself, and still is, on the line. To be in the room with Laurie Balin is such a joy and a pleasure. One of the first people I don't think Laurie actually knows this, one of the first people I ever interviewed, both on television and in radio. And Lynn Beasley, George, and others here in the room, and the next generation of giants of West Australian medical research here in this room. And I congratulate the foundation on its 40th anniversary. This great project of medical research that you're embarked upon. And of course, foundations have a very particular role to play, at least in my not so humble view, in terms of research funding. Because you can do stuff that the NH and MRC can't. The MRC is just too big, too burly, too cumbersome. Doesn't matter who's running it. It's just a bureaucracy that runs in its own way, and they do the best they can. It's not a bad job they do, but there's stuff they can't do. They're hamstrung. You can do anything. You can do anything. And you can integrate more into the community around you, look more like the Mayo Clinic's model, which is a community-based model, which then feeds into a hospital of the highest quality. And there are green shoots of that happening with their foundation's work, as you've heard in terms of the research awards. You can find areas which are weak areas which stop people doing as well as they could if only you could fund it, maybe to do with infrastructure. I'm not prescribing what they are, but there's just stuff that can be done. as well as here's the story that I've heard throughout my career as a medical broadcaster, medical journalist. I go into a lab somewhere in America or here or whatever, and I interview the researcher, and the researcher's really proud of their new findings. But if they're honest, they then say, you know, I did a literature review when I started this. Or I would say, where did you get the idea from? I say, well, I got this idea. Then I did this literature review. And, you know, somebody had this idea in 1962. There's a paper on it. It's amazing. But nothing, I don't know why, but nothing ever happened with it. Well, every person in this room knows what happened with it. They lost their grant. They lost their postdocs. They lost their PhD students because the grant that they got did not continue. Don Metcalf, who should have won a Nobel Prize for his work on colony stimulating factor, but didn't, was funded throughout his career by Cancer Council Victoria, or it used to be called the Anti-Cancer Council, Cancer Council Victoria, because of its visionary leader, Nigel Gray, who saw talent in Don, and convinced by Gus Nossel, and funded him throughout his career through thick and thin, through failure and success, and got this amazing result in the end. Which and there were other, don't get me on about who else should have won a Nobel laureate at a Nobel Prize at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. But nonetheless, it just gives you an idea of continuity of funding, intervening when you know things are, and intervening with flexibility and speed when people need help to get them beyond that when the research is going well. It's such an exciting time, particularly as the foundation is becoming in such a strong position moving forward here, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I also want to say that Bryant used to remind me of one of the neurosurgeons at the medical school I was at. Bryant's nothing like this, but he was an odd guy, very eccentric. And I still remember his lecture on subdural hematoma. And he brought out, very great flourish, a hand drill. And he said, if you think a patient's got subdural hematoma, and these are the days before CAT scans and MRIs, if you think they've got a subdural hematoma, it's safer to bring out your hand drill from the garage, dip it in cow shit, and drill a hole in the skull. So we all laughed, thought it was very funny. Anyway, there was a question in the final exam in surgery on the management of subdural hematoma. And one of my guys in my class wrote, you take the hand drill out of your garage. He became a doctor. I have no idea whatever happened to him. I'm here about talking about communicating science in tough times. It's not always tough times. I mean, sometimes it's actually really good fun. For 6 seasons, I was the medical host of Biggest Loser. Now, I'd built up years of reputation, a sober reputation as a journalist, and then they approached me to go on air to this program. Now, I don't know how many of you remember Biggest Loser. Probably you're too clever and too busy to have watched it. But essentially, they took the heaviest people you've ever seen in your life, and the person who lost the most weight and survived the horrible social situation won in the end. And they wanted me to go on to be the biggest bastard on The Biggest Loser, and I wasn't going to do that. But I thought, well, I'm used to talking to an ABC audience. I'm not used to talking to a commercial audience. I'll do it. What the heck? I said, I'll do it. I'm not going to be the biggest bastard, but I'll do it if you let me do evidence-based stuff on it, as well as the showbiz. So they reluctantly agreed, and they kept by it. So the first time I went on, so they were doing it in a big hall in North Head in Sydney in the old artillery barracks. And it was as live, 6 cameras, and you've got all the contestants there. And they wanted to do DEXA scans on all the contestants. Because most DEXA scans are mostly known for measuring bone mineral density in women around the time of the menopause to detect osteoporosis. But in fact, it's used in sports science as well because you can detect muscle mass, bone mass, and fat mass. So they said they're really good pictures. And I said, well, I don't want Australians to go out and get DEXA scans, right, left, and center. They said, oh, it's really good pictures. I said, okay, I'll do it as long as I can do the only thing that matters evidence-based wise, which is waist circumference. So we agreed. Anyway, they flash up the DEXA scans, and they truly were amazing. So as you would know better than me, so you can flash up the skeleton. So they flashed up the skeleton of a guy who's 240 kilos. Should I say that again? 240 kilos. So you know this. When you're carrying around 240 kilos, your skeleton looks pretty good. It's pretty strong. So the skeleton looks great. Then they flashed up the musculature. And of course, to carry around 240 kilos, your musculature is pretty good too. So he's starting to look like Commando, who's one of the trainers on there, really good. Then they flash up the fat mass, which is the adipose tissue, which is like, then it becomes a sphere. He was 52% fat. So we got this guy up on the stage like this, and I would do waist circumference. Now, I did pediatrics. I've never been a GP. And it's this point that any GPs in the audience think, what a complete bloody idiot this guy must be. And I hadn't worked this out, because I thought I could just do, that. And luckily, one of the producers was much smarter than me, and she'd got a bariatric tape measure. And then I realized, and this is like live, and I'm only realizing this as I'm doing it. So I actually got the guy to hold it there. I said, excuse me a moment, I'll just walk around. Won't be a moment. Came back. So he was 5'8" tall and 6 feet around the waist. So it was actually oval. But it was an incredible experience. But they allowed me to do the evidence-based stuff, which most of the time when you're communicating science, it's not in tough times. It's actually in good times, and you're trying to communicate messages that are translatable to people in the community. And before I get on to tough times, I just want to say that you will spend weeks of your life writing an abstract for an international conference. And I'm not decrying that. That's good, because your career depends on talking to your colleagues and getting that feedback. But there might be 50 or 70 people in the room. If I phone you up, you've got an audience of 250 to 400,000 people. And if some other programs phone you up, it's 1 million. And you don't, so what's the thought that you give to that process? So the first 2 years of broadcasting, probably around the time I first interviewed Laurie, whenever I did a show, I would spend a long time writing the script. And I would show it to other people and we'd read it back to, there was a year, not 2 years, there was more than that, where every time I wrote a script, is it understandable? Am I explaining this clearly? Am I using metaphor in the best possible way? And in fact, during COVID, effectively, I was an employee of 7:30 on ABC television, and they had a senior producer who was like an editor. And so after decades in broadcasting, I was back to where I started, because he would take, no matter how senior you were, he would take everybody's script and tear it apart and rebuild it in terms of clarity of communication. And that's what you got to do. This is not a natural process. Some people are better at it than others, but it's not a natural process. Now, some people and I'll come back to this later, is there are things that bother you when you're communicating, and one of them is uncertainty, because every researcher understands uncertainty. That's one of the problems with climate change, is that the climate change scientists have been too honest about uncertainty. And that's allowed the people who've opposed it, who are the merchants of doubt, to actually say, well, they're not definite about it, they're arguing amongst themselves, therefore it can't be true. And that's exactly what they did during the Voice campaign. They created doubt in the community. Unfortunately, some 2 or 3 Aboriginal leaders did it too. And that gave racists in the community license to say, well, I'm not a racist if you've got Aboriginal leaders saying the same thing. These are difficult times, but what I'm saying is that uncertainty is very difficult, but you cannot let it paralyze you, because you're not necessarily doing the audience a favor, or the people that you're talking to a favor, by doing that. Yeah, if you're a surgeon and you're taking informed consent, then you've got to be able to express that the risks, otherwise you can get into tiger country, and it's a talent. Now, sometimes I'll come back to that communication in a minute, but sometimes it's in a state of adversity. Dan Fadovich here, he and I last met when I was doing a story on thrombolysis and stroke. And Dan was thrown in the deep end by the College of Emergency Medicine to justify their policy as to why emergency physicians throughout Australia refused to set up, with some exceptions, thrombolysis services for stroke. Basically, this is a service which saved lives, reduced disability in an affordable way. And the College of Emergency, everybody ran for cover, and Dan was the last one standing, and acquitted himself incredibly well in that process. But sometimes you've got to have these tough conversations representing them. And I want to talk a little bit about COVID. You'd probably be disappointed if I didn't, because that's the toughest time we've all had. As John said, in 1990, I did a 4-part series for Channel 4, the UK, and SBS here on pandemics. So I was kind of ready for pandemics, but I actually didn't think, I thought I might live through a flu pandemic of some kind. We did in 2009, but it wasn't a huge pandemic. I didn't think I'd experience this. But I knew what to expect, because the history of pandemics is that politics cause pandemics. We cause pandemics. The way we live causes pandemics. Yep, sure, you needed a respiratory virus or a respiratory bacterium because it's going to be spread respiratory-wise, although AIDS is a pandemic and is sexually transmissible. But politics has always got in the way, going right back to Yersinia pestis and the Black Death and the 3 pandemics of plague, which, by the way, we're still in the 3rd pandemic of plague right now, but I don't have time to tell you about it. So I knew that it could actually get really rough. And I didn't really understand how rough it could get. And it was quite a surreal experience for every single person in this room, particularly those of you who are in infectious disease, microbiology, etc. The challenge was nobody knew anything pretty much. And so you were going in a kind of a fog, except that the Americans had war gamed a coronavirus pandemic not too long before the coronavirus. Because they knew the next pandemic was either going to be a coronavirus or an influenza pandemic. And then you had the situation where our government had advisors who, by and large, didn't know anything about non-influenza pandemics. And they had a pretty good influenza plan, but that's what they followed. And then you find yourself as a journalist knowing exactly what they're doing. They're following an influenza plan. Now, with an influenza plan, you've got a little bit of time. So you can say if it's really being bad in kids, you'll close down schools, and then you'll see what happens. Or if it's amongst elderly people, you'll isolate residential aged care, whatever. You have that plan, but you do something and you wait and see what happens. With a coronavirus pandemic, you've got to do everything all at once because the virus always wins. So what they were doing was this incremental process based on flu, which you knew wasn't going to work with coronavirus. To his credit, Brendan Murphy closed the borders, at least to Chinese, which saved a lot of lives in Australia. But then there was the question of lockdown. And we came very close to following Boris Johnson's lead. So Boris Johnson, with very bad advice, headed for herd immunity. 45,000 British people died in the first 6 months of the pandemic for the benefit of 6% population immunity to the coronavirus. So you found yourself in a situation which was a very dangerous situation for a journalist, which is, so what do you do with this? How do you express this? How do you do it at all? And the government grew to hate what we were doing, particularly what I was doing at the ABC, because they saw this as war. And in war, you follow what the government says. And when the government at the highest level complained to the ABC about me, they said, well, has he made any mistakes? And they said, no. So what's the problem? He's getting ahead of us. And the only way I was getting ahead of them was I didn't know anything. I just turned the page of the textbook. That's all you had to do to know what was going to happen next. But then you had the problem where I'd spent my career based on peer-reviewed research, where at least for all the flaws of peer-reviewed research, at least you'd had experts, far more expert than me, looking at it, which gave you a degree of security, even though you had to look at the papers from scratch. We were dealing with a flood of non-peer-reviewed research, which was getting published, yes, on servers, but it was getting published and anybody could look at it. And that was terrifying, because you actually had to look at this research, use what you'd learned in terms of critical evaluation of literature, and even then, particularly with difficult molecular biology, molecular genetics, and so on, all the stuff that was coming out, I had to have a group of people, by the way, none of whom were used by the government as advisors, who actually knew about pandemics, knew how to deal with them, knew that this was spread by aerosols. The government still has the same advisors there who basically don't believe that respiratory viruses are spread by aerosols. Still don't believe it. The state government that's at the forefront of this is Victoria. They're the ones who are putting in major regulations. We care more about outdoor air quality than we do indoor air quality. And it was rough. But the element here, and it's the element that you have too, which is trust. Because as medical researchers, as science researchers, you have the trust of the community. You're amongst the most trusted. Journalists like me are down at the bottom, along with Scott Morrison and other politicians. But you are at the highest level in terms of the community trust. And the ABC is as well. So the hardest moment was when the clotting problem with AstraZeneca emerged. So as you remember, this was a clotting problem which emerged with low platelet counts. And you had the chief medical officer, you had the head of the TGA, and you had ATAGI, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, saying this was rubbish, it was not biologically plausible. I was at a meeting here in Perth, actually, around about that time, and I'll double back. So this looked to me to be really weird. And then they were saying that basically the Danes, the Germans, the Finns were just scaredy pants and for pulling this off the market temporarily while they worked it out. I thought, these are people with incredible researchers in immunology, microbiology, and public health. There must be something to this. And then when you delved into it, of course there was something to it. There was a particularly German researcher who'd actually worked out the mechanism. At the same time as the country was being told, there is no mechanism, there's no biological possibility. I was at a meeting here in Perth where I explained this background to a group of doctors here, and somebody stood up who purportedly understood immunization to tell the room that it was rubbish and not to listen to what I was saying. So the question then was, do I broadcast on this issue knowing that it will create some fear and concern? And I did. And the judgment I made was that people had to know who to trust, not me, but the ABC. And in times of fear, you had to give something to cling to. And while some state premiers and chief health officers were doing it, and the Commonwealth started to do it quite well, there was still that wobble there. And I got a text from a Liberal member of Parliament, coalition member of federal Parliament, who I know quite well, saying, you realise you're solely responsible for vaccine hesitancy in Australia. And those are the difficult moments, and that's not about science. Well, it's partly about science, but it's also about politics. And what we saw during COVID, because of the anger, because of ideology, you saw the rise of anti-science in a way that I haven't seen before, and you saw it globally. And I don't think it happened so much in Western Australia because you had hard as though it was, you had a pretty good time of it because you were isolated. and you didn't experience the lockdowns as much as the East Coast, particularly New South Wales and Victoria. But you had these movements of people carrying their Australian flags and going on these marches and demonstrations to complain about, and very strongly anti-vax, with conspiracy theories about immunization, about where the thing. I still get emails from people. I mean, it wasn't just that the immunization gives you, injects some CIA monitoring device into you. Other stuff as well, where people just didn't believe it, and it did an enormous amount of damage to science. And what the people recognized was that the way we were controlling the way some people were in power were responding to the pandemic was partly ideological and not science-based as well. But we did a pretty good job. And it was kind of inevitable. We didn't do a good job of vaccine procurement, and which is why tens of thousands of Australians died when we opened up too soon, before we'd actually achieved full immunization. But we did a pretty good job by international standards. But it wasn't a great time, and it was about communicating science in tough moments. And it'll happen again. And it's happening now with climate change. So if you look at the Daily Mail, News Limited, the same opinion leaders who are decrying climate change and saying it's all rubbish and it's all just a plot and you don't need to worry about it and fossil fuels are the best way to go. These are exactly the same people who said the ABC were panic merchants and creating unnecessary concern, and we should never have locked down, and caused huge devastation to the Australian community. Exactly the same people. Not bedfellows, they were the exact same people. And then this whole thing about lab or bat with the origins of the virus. And that's about politics, and that's about particularly News Limited's anti-Chinese stance, Trump's anti-Chinese stance. The Conservative parties are looking more and more Trumpist as each day goes on, unfortunately. And they will not see a bounce from the Voice because, and I say that as partially as I can, because I think the Australian public is fair and reasonable and understands what's going on. But we're a very dangerous period where the future of the planet is being influenced by people who are anti-science. They're pro-science when it suits them, and anti-science when it suits them. It is highly cynical, and we as researchers have got to stick to the knitting, which is, if it's unpalatable, doesn't fit with Labour Party politics or Liberal Party politics, we just got to call it out. Science is not, the work that you do is not party political. Implementing it might be, but actually giving the results and just giving it fair and square are really important. I was one of the founding board members of the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, which is the sister of NDRI here in Western Australia. And we often had unpalatable messages about drug use in Australia, but we got respected by both sides of politics because we called it straight. I mean, I'm on the board of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, which was founded by Fiona Stanley. And again, we call it as it is, and you get respect from both sides of Parliament. So when you actually do the science, it does make a difference, but communicating it can be tough. And just finally, all I can say about the techniques of communication is that don't be scared of uncertainty. What we did, we had this podcast called CoronaCast, and we didn't know what was happening. We just got onto it and did it. And it was a while later we just realized the audience, 3 million people a month were coming in. We got 200,000 questions between March and June in. But we realized at the end of every CoronaCast, we actually had, despite all the uncertainty, we actually had to provide clarity. So I think that a lot of scientists and researchers who communicate get paralyzed by that uncertainty. I think you've got to land on a position. Now, you just had Catherine's presentation on nitrates. You could say, well, God, we kind of knew, didn't we know that already, that it was red meat and blah, blah, and processed meat? And one of the reasons that Catherine had to do that was just, the Meat and Livestock Corporation fight back. The red, they say it's not nitrates, it's something else. And people love to say it's rubbish and vegetables are going to kill you. So you spend all that money and effort proving something you kind of knew already. I'm not criticizing the research. It's great that it's done now. Put it away, move on, and show the benefits of high nitrate containing vegetables. I'll have to write a new chapter for my book on living younger and longer. Thanks, Catherine. And just remember about perception of risk. When we tend to react more to the negative than the positive, it's just part of the way we are. The example I use is, imagine we're hunter-gatherers and we're in Africa and we're walking through the savanna grassland with our family group. Sun's shining, the wind's blowing, grass is rustling. What has the more survival advantage? Turning to your partner and say, darling, isn't it a wonderful day? Sun's shining, you can hear the wind blowing in the grass, or shit, there's a tiger there, let's run. We are tuned to the negative. If we weren't, we wouldn't have survived as a species. We're exquisitely tuned to the negative. And those who preach the negative win out in the end. And whether that's journalists, whether that's people pushing a political point and others, you've got lots of positive stories to tell. Don't worry about it, just tell them. Thank you very much.